It began in the early hours of December 7, 2025. Gunfire echoes through Cotonou, Benin's largest city. Residents wake to confusion spreading through WhatsApp groups and text messages. Then, state television flickers to life with an image that hasn't been seen in Benin for 53 years. Soldiers in combat fatigues, armed, sitting behind a desk, claiming they've just overthrown the government. The officer in charge cites a deteriorating security situation in the north and the government's disregard and neglect of our fallen brothers in arms. Within hours, loyalist forces storm back. The mutiny collapses. President Talon appears on television, vowing to punish the adventurers responsible for this coup attempt. Behind the scenes, Nigeria scrambles fighter jets to help Benin army retake the airwaves. By nightfall, it's all over. West African leaders breathe a collective sigh of relief. Another coup averted, democracy preserved. But here's what they are not telling you. The real coup in Benin happened some years ago. December 7th wasn't the beginning of this crisis. If anything, it was merely a symptom of a crisis that has been building since 2016. And that is the story I want to tell you. I want to show you how one of Africa's most celebrated democracies became a cautionary tale and why the world should be paying attention beyond the headlines of December 7th.
Military Committee for Refoundation, CMR, which met on Sunday 7th of December 2025 in Cotonou, deliberated and decided the following. Mr. Patrice Talon is removed from office as President of the Republic.
To understand how shocking this moment was, you need to understand what Benin used to be. Between 1960 and 1972, the country, then called Dahomey, was a complete mess. 6 successful military coups in 12 years. Governments rose and fell like seasons. The military became the ultimate arbiter of power, stepping in whenever civilian politics collapsed. The last successful coup came on October 26, 1972, when Major Matthew Keriko led soldiers into a presidential meeting and simply announced it was over. He declared himself head of state, later transforming Benin into a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship that would last 17 years. But then, something extraordinary happened. By 1990, Keriko's regime ran out of money. Civil servants couldn't get paid for months, and the reason for this was not so hard to see. The Soviet Union was collapsing, and so was its support for all allied states. Benin's economy was in free fall, and people were angry. In February of that year, under mounting pressure, Keriko allowed something unprecedented. A national conference where 488 delegates from every corner of Beninese society, including opposition parties, unions, churches, student groups, all gathered to decide the country's future. The conference declared itself sovereign, meaning Keriko couldn't overrule its decisions. They quickly drafted a new democratic constitution. They organized multi-party elections, and in March 1991, when the votes were counted, Keriko had lost. A dictator who had ruled for 19 years did something almost unthinkable in Africa. He accepted defeat and stepped down peacefully. Benin became the first African country to transition from dictatorship to democracy through the ballot box. It was a miracle, and for the next 25 years, that miracle held. Presidents came and went through elections. Power alternated peacefully. Even the same Keriko returned at some point as a civilian politician. He won in 1996, then respected term limits and left in 2006. Freedom House rated Benin as free, a score of 82 out of 100 in 2017, one of the highest in Africa. The country had gone 53 years without a successful coup. In a region plagued by instability, Benin was the exception, the model, the success story. Then came Patrice Talon. In 2016, Talon was a political outsider, a self-made cotton magnate worth $400 million. He had earned the name King of Cotton for dominating Benin's most important export industry. He had been close to previous presidents, financing campaigns, working behind the scenes, but he had never held office himself. So, more like the Donald Trump of African politics. Well, his campaign pitch was seductive. He was a businessman who could run the country like a company. He promised to modernize the economy, fight corruption, and most remarkably, limit his own power. Talon pledged to serve only one term, arguing that a single 6-year term would prevent the complacency that came with re-election campaigns. 5 years mean 5 years, his supporters repeated. In a region where presidents routinely altered constitutions to stay in power, this was revolutionary. And he won. On April 6, 2016, Talon took office. It was a peaceful transition. Democracy in Benin seemed as strong as ever, but almost immediately, something began to shift.
The citizens' vote as a means of expression of its accession to the democratic ideal must be rid of all restitutive or financial considerations.
Within months, Talon appointed Joseph Jobenu, his personal lawyer and close friend, as Minister of Justice. 2 years later, in June 2018, Joe Bello was elevated to President of the Constitutional Court, the highest judicial authority in the country. This wasn't just another appointment. This was the capture of the referee. With Joe Bello at the helm, the Constitutional Court transformed from an independent watchdog into an instrument of presidential power. And then, the rules changed. In October 2018, Benin's National Assembly, increasingly stacked with Talon's allies, passed a new electoral code. On paper, the reform seemed reasonable. Streamline the chaotic party system, raise standards, make politics more professional. You see, Benin had over 200 registered parties, many of them tiny and inactive. According to Talon's government, this was ineffective. They argued that too much fragmentation made governance impossible. But look closer at what the law actually did. Parties now needed a certificate of conformity from the Interior Ministry to compete in elections. The requirements were opaque, the process selective. The filing fee jumped to $427,000, nearly $500,000 just to register. Party membership requirements skyrocketed. You needed 1,555 founding members, up from just 120 before. Then came the real killer. To win seats in parliament, the party needed to capture at least 10% of the national vote. Anything less and you got nothing. This wasn't just about quality control anymore. This was about pricing out competition and mathematically eliminating smaller parties. And it worked. When the deadline arrived for the April 2019 parliamentary elections, not a single opposition party had obtained the required certificate of conformity. Not one. The Election Commission disqualified every opposition party list. In the end, only 2 parties appeared on the ballot, both aligned with President Talon. So in essence, an election with 0 opposition. You could vote for Talon's Party A or Talon's Party B. That was the choice. The opposition saw what was happening and called for a protest. In February 2019, demonstrations erupted across Cotonou. People filled the streets, demanding the restoration of real democracy. The government's response was brutal. Police fired tear gas into crowds. An 83-year-old former First Lady, Rosine Soglo, a sitting member of parliament at the time, was engulfed in choking flames. In the northern town of Kilibo, a protester was shot dead, and then came election day, April 28, 2019. The country was eerily quiet. Opposition supporters boycotted en masse. Official turnout was 27.1%, the lowest since 1991. Unofficial estimates put actual participation even lower, somewhere around 26%. It became clear to the people, this wasn't democracy anymore. But without opposition voices on the ballot, their only form of protest was absence. The result was exactly what you would expect. An 88-seat parliament with 100% loyalty to President Talon, not a single opposition voice. Within months, this rubber-stamped legislature passed constitutional amendments without a referendum. They created a vice presidency, filled with Talon's ally. They adjusted the electoral calendar, all done with no countervailing power, no debate, no checks. Benin's democracy didn't collapse. It was methodically dismantled, law by law, vote by vote, all perfectly legal on paper. That same year, Freedom House downgraded Benin from free to partly free. The poster child for African democracy had finally fallen. But Talon wasn't done. The 2019 parliamentary purge was just the beginning. To truly consolidate power, he needed to control not just who could run, but who could win the presidency. In 2019, a new rule was introduced. Any presidential candidate needed to be sponsored by at least 10% of the country's national deputies and mayors. In practice, that meant securing around 16 endorsements from the 109 members of parliament and 77 communal mayors. Now, here's the problem with that. After the 2019 elections, nearly all of those officials were loyal to Talon. The opposition had been systematically locked out of local and national government. So, when the 2021 presidential election approached, opposition candidates faced an impossible task: get endorsement from the very people who wanted them gone. The results were predictable and devastating. Rekia Madogo, a charismatic former minister running on the opposition ticket, was arrested in March 2021. And the charge, well, plotting to disrupt the election. There was virtually no evidence presented. Within months, she was tried by a special court, the Court for the Repression of Economic Crimes and Terrorism, whose judges were handpicked by presidential decree, and she was sentenced to 20 years in prison for, quote, terrorism. And then there's Professor Joel Ivo, a constitutional scholar who dared criticize the regime and attempted to run for president. He was arrested days after the vote. He received 10 years for alleged money laundering and plotting against the state. Between March and April 2021, over 100 opposition politicians and activists were detained. On April 11, 2021, The presidential election proceeded as scheduled. Only two relatively unknown candidates were allowed to stand against Talon. Men with no national profile, no serious campaigns, no chance of winning. Major opposition parties called for a boycott again. In many towns, especially in the south where opposition support ran strong, polling stations sat nearly empty. Official turnout was reported at 50%. Domestic observers estimated the real figure at 26%. Roughly 1 in 4 eligible voters actually participated in this election. Despite this historic low, President Talon was declared the winner with 86% of the vote. International observers like African Union and ECOWAS, as usual, praised the calm and orderly conduct of the election. But here's the thing, calm isn't the same as fair. The outcome had been determined months earlier, when serious competitors were systematically barred or imprisoned. In the days before the vote, protesters tried to block roads in Parakou and Save. They burned tires, demanding real democracy. Security forces opened fire. At least 5 people were killed. When asked about the unrest, a government spokesperson dismissed it as a totally pointless cause. Patrice Talon had been re-elected, and in doing so, he had completed the transformation of Benin from a multi-party democracy to an electoral autocracy. Elections happened on schedule. The constitution was technically followed, but competition, the essential ingredient of democracy, had been extinguished. For the next 2 years, Benin lived under what can only be described as a tightening grip. Rakia Madogo and Joel Ivo remained in prison, their trials condemned by human rights organizations as deeply unfair. Press freedom collapsed. Benin dropped 43 places in global press freedom rankings between 2016 and 2022. Journalists who exposed police killings or criticized the government faced arrest. Major television stations were forced off the air. Online media outlets were banned. Labor unions saw new restrictions. Strikes were outlawed in justice, health, and security sectors and limited to just 10 days per year in other fields. NGOs were now required to re-register and pay steep fees, a process activists said was designed to squeeze out critical organizations. The political atmosphere shifted from vibrant debate to quiet resignation. Freedom of assembly, once widely respected, became dangerous. And after seeing 5 protesters killed in 2021, people stopped demonstrating altogether. But this silence wasn't peace, it was fear. And yet, Talon's government pointed to undeniable economic achievements like GDP growth, which hit 5.5% in 2023, with the IMF projecting over 6% for 2024. Benin became Africa's top cotton producer. Infrastructure improved, new roads, digital services, investments in agriculture. The government claimed to be delivering stability and prosperity, and in their eyes, the cost of freedom is worth it. But there was this other cost, one the government rarely discussed. It was the war in the north. You see, since 2019, jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been pushing south from the Sahel, probing Benin's northern borders. For years, Benin had been spared direct attacks, but now that immunity is gone. In May 2023, militants killed at least 15 villagers and kidnapped a dozen more in Kero district. According to conflict data, attacks on civilians jumped 75% from 2022 to 2023, 182 incidents in a single year. Thousands of people fled border areas. The Beninese military deployed more troops, rushed training, bought equipment from France, Turkey, China, even Russia. And yet, the political elite in Cotonou seemed more focused on power games than the soldiers dying in remote northern outposts. Which brings us to the mutinous soldiers on December 7th, 2025, who cited, quote, the disregard and neglect of our fallen brothers in arms as justification for their coup attempt. They were pointing to a disconnect that ordinary Beninese felt too. While the north burned, the government's energy was consumed by constitutional manipulations and electoral engineering. By 2022, pressure on Talon's government was mounting. International partners were uneasy about the democratic backsliding. In June 2022, the regime made what appeared to be a concession. Dozens of low-level political detainees were released from jail. Then came another surprise. The main opposition party finally received legal recognition after years of being denied. The January 2023 parliamentary elections looked different. 7 parties competed, 4 pro-government, 3 opposition. There was no violence, no internet shutdown like in 2019. Opposition parties were back on the ballot. In fact, the main opposition party won 28 seats out of 109. Turnout ticked up slightly to 37.8%. International observers welcomed this as, quote, progress. Even Freedom House improved Benin's score slightly. It looked like an opening, a return to competitive politics. But look at the numbers more carefully. The ruling party still held 81 seats, more than the 2/3 supermajority needed to amend the constitution unilaterally. The opposition's 28 seats gave them a voice in parliament, but not power. They could question ministers, debate bills, but they couldn't block anything. This was the calculation. Allow token opposition for legitimacy, but keep real power unchanged. It was a masterclass in managed democracy, and it set the stage for what came next.
I think we are definitely leaving behind the dark pages of our political history. The election was approached with enthusiasm and no boycott.
July 2025. Talon made an announcement that surprised many. He firmly rejected calls for a third term. Quote, "Benin is greater than all of us." His spokesperson quoted him saying he would step down in 2026, allowing someone else to lead. The praise was immediate. Here was an African leader respecting term limits in a region where presidents routinely overstayed their welcome. Talon was being held up as a statesman, a proof that democracy in Benin would somehow survive. But watch what happened next. In October 2025, the ruling coalition announced their chosen successor, Romuald Wadangi, Talon's finance minister, the man who had overseen the economic growth the government loved to tout. This was fair game. Then the main opposition party put forward their own candidate, Renaud Abojo. But when the sponsorship endorsements were counted, Abojo had failed to secure the required 16 endorsements from MPs and mayors. The Constitutional Court, every single member appointed by Talon's parliamentary majority, upheld the disqualification on October 28, 2025. The top opposition party had been barred from the 2026 presidential election, not by voters, not even by their own shortcomings, but by a technicality in a system rigged to exclude them. On October 24th, Talon and opposition leader Boni Yayi held a rare one-on-one meeting at the presidential palace, an attempt to defuse the mounting crisis. Outside, opposition activists were furious, calling the upcoming election a sham. But nothing changed. The exclusion stood. Then 3 weeks later came the final move. On November 14, 2025, the National Assembly voted 90-19 to pass sweeping constitutional changes. The vote split exactly along party lines. Ruling coalition versus opposition. They extended the presidential term from 5 years to 7. The change wouldn't apply to Talon himself, but it would apply to whoever won in 2026, meaning they would rule until 2033. And there was more. There was the creation of a new Senate with 25 to 30 members that would include all former heads of state as lifetime members. Now, hold on, let me translate that for you. It means when President Talon leaves office in 2026, he would automatically get a seat in this powerful new chamber, possibly as his president, giving him influence over Benin's governance for decades to come. This man seems to be making himself president for life, just with a different title this time. No referendum, no public consultation, just a constitutional overhaul rammed through by a supermajority that had already excluded the real opposition from competing. This was a trap. Talon could claim he was respecting term limits while simultaneously rigging who could replace him and guaranteeing himself power after leaving office. It was authoritarianism with a democratic mask. And that's where the soldiers moved. On December 7, 2025, mutinous troops seized state television. They cited the deteriorating security situation in the north and the neglect of falling soldiers. Within hours, the coup attempt failed. Talon crushed it. Nigeria sent fighter jets. ECOWAS deployed troops to Benin, an unprecedented move for what was supposed to be the region's stable democracy. But here's what everyone missed. This attempted coup wasn't the crisis, it was the alarm bell. It was the system cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. You can't claim to deliver stability while crushing all dissent. You can't run sham elections and expect people to believe the facade forever. You can't imprison opposition leaders, silence journalists, bar parties from ballots, and think there will be no consequences. December 7th was crushed not because the people are in support of the government, but because the real coup happened years earlier. And that is the story.